The following is brought to you by Vertical Vet. Rethink your GPO.
Hi, and welcome to another wonderful Business Academy webinar. I am Dr. Ernie Ward, Executive Director of Education for Vertical Vet, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to another in a long series of programs designed to help your practice succeed financially. And so today we're going to have a really important topic about exit strategy. And while you may be at a point in your career where you're not even considering retirement, or you may be at a point in your career where you're saying, how quickly can I get out? It's really important for you to have a plan in place years in advance. And I can tell you firsthand that prior preparation makes all the difference when it comes to getting the best valuation for your practice. And so today we are really fortunate to have one of our strategic partners, First Financial Bank, and we've got two wonderful experts who do this literally all day long. So we have Schwanda Flowers, who has been with us before at Vertical Vet and another Business Academy series. And we've got also one of her colleagues today. We're going to have Ashlee Moore with us. And guys, before we jump into this, right now we're kind of coming out of the pandemic. So this is being recorded after, when most practices are starting to come back to life, so to speak. Are you guys hearing, at least this is what I'm hearing, I'm hearing a lot of vets say, now's the time to get out. Are you guys hearing similar kinds of thoughts out there?
Yeah, so I think that there's two ways to look at that. This has been a very busy time for many veterinarians, and so although we went through a couple of months of shutdown and 2020 was very stressful, this industry has rebounded, and veterinarians are busier than ever. And so, if there was a veterinarian who was thinking about retirement before the pandemic, I think that they are certainly thinking about it is time to get out now, because it's been a challenging year. But then on the flip side of that, this is an excellent time for that associate veterinarian to step in and take over and leap into ownership.
Yeah, and Ashlee, that's really what I was digging at, because you're right. All the stressors that we've gone through, and a lot of people are just like, oh my gosh, I just can't wait I'm done, right? But it is a huge opportunity for young veterinarians to assume some ownership responsibilities.
Absolutely. I think, along with how busy and just the changing landscape that we've seen, there's been a big shift into, technology-based things where people are having appointments just like this over video, right, or mobile vet clinics. So I think somebody who might have had their practice for a long time isn't ready to make those changes, where associate veterinarians might be ready for that. So I think like you said, now is the perfect time for an associate to step in, or somebody who has been thinking about retirement to pass those reins on. Just things are changing in general anyway. So even the clientele will be, ready for some adaptation.
Oh, really good point, Ashlee, and one I hadn't considered before. And you're right. I mean, in this time of tumultuous change, it's like, okay, yeah, I get it. The vet is selling the practice, and the younger vet's taking over. So I love that fact. Now, I before we get into some of the metrics and some of the mechanics of practice valuation today, which I'm super excited to talk to you guys about, Schwanda, just real quick, I think that one of the things that the pandemic should have taught people that are considering retirement or selling their practice over the next couple of years even, is the fact that you need to prepare long time in advance. Because I know what I'm hearing also is that people are sort of not knowing how to handle the pandemic year, right? So now it's suddenly they want to sell their practice. They're really relying on historical data, 2, 3, 4 years prior to COVID-19. I mean, that's what I'm hearing. Are you guys seeing the same thing?
Yes. And, I think it is a great point, because I do think that, many of us in all kinds of, business industries, we sort of put off the things that we don't enjoy. And we find that sometimes, the financial bookkeeping is not something that veterinarians enjoy doing.
No.
And it is a chore. And sometimes it can be very tedious, and you need a good team around you to do that. But one of the most important things that you can do is to be sure that your finances are in order. You know where your tax returns are. You filed your tax returns. I think, sitting in our seats, Ashlee and I, we see that all the time, that, oh, well, I haven't filed my taxes, and I don't have my profit and loss statements. I don't have year-end financials done. And it is very, very busy. And I have some veterinarians say, I'm working on this every single minute that I'm not in surgery. And so, we don't fault them for the fact that this has been a crazy year. But if they haven't thought about keeping their finances in order for the last several years, there's going to be a lot of work to do, because we're looking at 3 years of historical financial data for these practices when we look at valuation. And so in many cases that is going to be 17, 18, and 19. Maybe 2020 taxes aren't done yet, but we are going to want to see those financials for 2020. And then we're also going to want to see current year to date financials more than ever. And so that's very important, that every quarter that you're looking at your financials, you're having your accountant or your software do that for you. But we're going to want to look at 2021 financials and even compare those to 2019.
Right.
So yeah.
And Ashlee, one of the things too that Schwanda just said, I want to reemphasize, because I think a lot of people have misconceptions. Okay, 2020 was a bit of a mulligan. There's going to be an asterisk by that in the economic ledgers of every business in the world. Okay, so I get that. But really what I'm hearing from my friends out there, in the valuation world as well, is we're looking at two things. One, what did it look like in 2019? And then number two, how quickly are you rebounding to pre-quote unquote COVID numbers? Is that also how you're applying some of this, how do we deal with this pandemic?
Yes, that's exactly right. We're looking at what was the practice doing beforehand, how healthy was it, what was their cash flows then, and then how quickly were they able to bounce back. Obviously, especially at the beginning of 2020, some places had to stop performing, what they would call elective procedures, even wellness visits. Everything was just emergency. So clearly, there's going to be some changes there. There's going to be some differences in what the practice is doing, but the most important things is what they were doing pre-pandemic and how quickly they were able to either adapt or just bounce back.
Yeah. And Schwanda, again, I was talking to a colleague of mine a couple of weeks ago, and they were like, well, now's a terrible time to sell, Ernie, because my 2020 numbers are awful. They were in the toilet. And, and I'm like, wait a second, not so fast. This actually may be a better opportunity than you think. And could you just maybe briefly talk about the valuations? Like, because again, practices are selling at all-time highs, like right now. And I think that needs to be reemphasized.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, what we're doing when we look at that is, even if you had a bad year in 2020, we are not penalizing, veterinarians necessarily for that if they're rebounding. So, if we can look at 2021, that's similar to 2019, that's a very positive thing. But anytime that we do evaluation, we do go back historically. So we're going to take a 3-year average. So, if 18 and 19 were great years and then 20 is down, just remember that you do have that cushion of a couple of good years also. And then if you've rebounded, we take that into account too. We work with great companies who do third-party valuations, and they look at every detail of the finances, and they're doing this every day. And so they absolutely know the impact of COVID and what happened last year.
Well, and speaking of the importance of details and record keeping, Ashlee, let's just kind of kick this conversation off about what are some of the typical methods that you use to value a practice. I mean, there are a lot of people that, have these misconceptions. Oh, you'll get gross plus whatever, or multiples of profit. I mean, it's sometimes that simple, but most of the time it's a lot more complicated.
Right. I mean, historically, there has been an old way of valuing the practices that is just 1 times gross sales. And it was, pretty simple, but that's been a little bit difficult just because of the differences in expenses and the, cost of goods and all of those types of things. So, really we're looking at that cash flow plus times a multiplier. So right now we're looking at about an average of 4.5 to 6 times cash flow when valuing a practice, but we've seen, some, corporate situations where it's 10, 12 times, but on average, we're seeing about 4.5 to 6 times cash flow when valuing practices.
And Schwanda, that's really a good point that I want to sort of latch onto, that the valuations from a corporate buyer may be very different than an individual buyer. And I think that too often we overlook that. Also, if you're a specialty clinic or have a niche offering, that also impacts your value, right?
Yes, absolutely. So right now we are in an environment where there are a lot of corporate entities that are buying practices. Usually those are larger practices. So three, four, five veterinarians at least. They're not necessarily, in general, interested in smaller one or two DVM practices. Those corporate buyers are paying a lot more than what you could get financed through a bank like us, and that's important for associate veterinarians to understand. So they don't need to get into a bidding war with a corporate entity. They don't need to get emotional about that, because those corporate entities are paying 10, 12, 15 times your cash flow. And really when we do a valuation, the practice is not going to value that high, but the corporate entities don't need loans, so they aren't fined by those valuations. They can pay whatever they need to purchase that practice if they want it for whatever their strategic reason. Individual buyers are going to have to stick to what a bank can value that for, because that's what we can lend, and that's usually about 4.5 to 6 times cash flow.
Right. And that's a really good point. Ashlee, another way to look at this, and I would argue maybe the flip side of this is, okay, there are a lot of vets out there saying, look, I'm a 1 or 2 doctor clinic. I'm grossing barely $1 million. Nobody's going to buy my clinic. And I would argue there are plenty of individual buyers that they need to be looking at, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of vets pretty quickly out of school or have been practicing for a couple of years who would love to take over a 1-2 vet practice and grow from that point forward. So, I mean, if there's a concern that, they're too small or whatever the case, maybe they're not going to get a look from the corporate buyers, but there's definitely private buyers out there who would be interested in that situation.
Yeah, that's what I found too, Ashlee. I mean, it's like, I agree, like 5-7 years ago, it was a tougher sell. Today, it seems like, honestly, if you're a veterinary clinic and you put a for sale sign out, you got a buyer. I mean, it's almost that, I'm not exactly exaggerating, Schwanda, am I?
No, you're not. I think we get calls all the time. So, do you know of a practice for sale? I'm ready to buy. Let me know if you know of anything in this area. And we try to connect those buyers, with veterinarians who are ready to sell. And so, if you're ready to transition and sell, let us know. If you're ready to buy, let us know. We are happy to connect, those individuals. But, I think that the goal and what I try to encourage veterinarians that have smaller practices is, this is the time to grow. So if you're ready to transition and retire, that's wonderful. If it's an associate ready to buy that practice, well, their goal should be that in a few years, they're a 4 or 5 DVM practice and they're getting those looks with the really high multipliers.
That's right. Okay, so just back to the basics, Ashlee, real quick. When we look at it, it's really, I think the movement has been towards cash flow. That's been the valuation. But there are a couple of other methods. Maybe you just briefly describe some of the way other people might value a practice, just briefly.
Yeah, I mean, they might be looking at like real estate, for example, what the value of the actual building. It depends on, if they're planning on purchasing the building that the business is in or whatnot. Schwanda, do you have any ideas on other valuation
Yeah,
methods?
and it may, Ashley's exactly right. So real estate plays a big part in
Right.
this, and banks like to lend, for dirt.
Right.
So real estate can play a big part in that. Specialty equipment, you mentioned, Dr. Ward, earlier that there are some specialty practices, and if a veterinarian is interested in that same niche, that equipment is worth much more. And so the area of the country, geography plays a
Right.
big part in how we value the practice. And so, all of those things are going to come into play. Inventory. Sometimes those things are much more important than the cash flow. We also know that there are some creative accounting methods that that business owners use sometimes, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but sometimes it is important for those owners to take a step back a few years before they're ready to sell and kind of normalize that. And so take out some of those really personal things that we might not be able to give you credit for, because it's going to make your cash flow look very different. So if you've been using, some of that cash flow for personal use or things that a new owner wouldn't have an expense, item for, get that out of your books and kind of normalize it, because that's going to also change how we can value the practice.
Yeah, and again, as we get into sort of what you need to do, Schwanda, true story, a good friend of mine, very large clinic, one of the large states and one of the most desirable cities. He probably got dinged by about $1.5 million in value because of practices running different expenses through the business. And, he was sort of eager to sell quickly. So he didn't have the I guess you would say, the privilege of waiting 2 or 3 years down the road. And yeah, he got dinged seriously. And it was kind of funny, Schwanda, because he said that the valuation, when they came back and gave him the numbers, and he was like, incensed and saying, no, it's worth much more. You don't understand. I'm doing this and this. And they're like, hey, we can only pay you based on what we can see. And if you're playing all this other stuff, we need to see that clearly. And so what are some of the things, Schwanda, that a vet needs to start assembling? I mean, because we just mentioned this is a good example where it actually came back to devalue this person's clinic, but what are the things that the reports and sort of the accounting that they need to have in hand?
Yeah, so I think what some of the most important are going to be a balance sheet and your profit and loss statement. So, sometimes, 2020, especially if you haven't done your taxes, those end of year profit and loss statements look very different than they do once your taxes are done. And so we prefer to have tax returns when taxes are filed. But if not, we need a really good profit and loss statement. And then we need a really good balance sheet. We see everything from very extensive, software programs or, accounting firms that will put things together for us, all the way to handwritten balance sheets. And so that's very important. But looking at your inventory, looking at your equipment, depreciating those things. That's very important when we start to look at a practice and what the value is. Keeping your practice up. I mean, is the facility, especially if you're going to try to sell the building, is the facility kept well? I mean, are there repairs that need to happen? Those things you're also going to take a pretty big ding for on the value, overall value, sales price, if there's repairs that need to be done or renovations that need to be done, or you don't have any kind of digital x-ray equipment, you're still using film. I mean, there's all kinds of things like that when a new owner comes in, they're not going to want to pay what you think it's worth, because they know that they're going to have to purchase all of these things, and that goes into their loan size. So take those into account when you're starting to think about that transition. Staffing is another important thing. Really look at your staffing. Either too few or too many, neither one are good. So be sure that you're not paying people who you don't need, you don't have excess staff, but also you might have somebody there for 30 years and can do everything. Well, they might not stay. Right. So, is there a good plan in place for that transition for staffing?
Yeah, Ashlee, one other thing too, because these reports are going to be highly scrutinized, as they should be. And, I have a lot of vets who will call me and say things like, can you believe this? They're asking for more. And they're making me validate these numbers, and I have to reconcile 3 years ago. I mean, this isn't personal, right? This is business.
Right. Absolutely. And honestly, one of the first things we tell buyers when they're looking at practice is do not accept outdated financials. It's, just like you said, good business practice to be able to share those numbers with each other. And it's not that we don't trust you. It's not that we don't believe you. It's just that from the buyer and the bank's perspective, we need to have all of that data in place just to make sure, one, we're protecting the buyer, but two, we're protecting you. We're giving you a fair valuation of your business. If there's something missing from there, might lower the value, and we don't want that to happen either. So we're just trying to be fair from all sides.
Yeah, exactly. It's just due diligence. So don't take it personally, guys. Schwanda, again, the back and forth can take a little bit of time. In your experience and with First Financial Bank, like, what's the typical timeline? Like, so I want to sell today. We have a buyer interested. What's the timeline look like?
So, we, from the time we get a loan approved, and so when you produce all the financials and Ashlee and I take a look at your package, we get it to loan committee pretty quickly, usually in about a week or two. all the information. And then probably 60 to 75 days, we've closed, you can transition, it goes pretty smoothly. But on the front end of that, honestly, the longest part of that is usually getting the financials from the seller to the buyer and the bank.
Yeah, just to pick up on where, Schwanda left off with that, we sometimes get financials very quickly from veterinarians where, we request tax returns, we request the balance sheet, the P&Ls, and we have them within a day or two. Other times, it can take a good amount of time to get all of that information together, which is definitely why we say to get prepared as quickly as possible. Pull all of that data, have it ready. That way we're not scrambling those last couple of weeks. And if you are ready to sell very quickly, we can compile all of the information needed and get you to that close date faster.
Yeah, and Schwanda, Ashlee just kind of picked up when we lost you there, but it can go very quickly. It can take months to get this stuff together. So if you are remotely considering selling within the next 3 to 5 years, you need to get your house in order today from a wide variety of perspectives. Now, Ashlee, I know that you go into a lot of clinics and you see a lot of clinics' financial data. What are some of the areas that right now a clinic is saying, yeah, I'm thinking about, selling my clinic in the next several years, but the value isn't where I think it should be or could be? What are some of those areas of opportunities that you see almost universally in clinics that they could improve upon to increase their valuation?
One that I think Schwanda already touched on is staffing. We see a lot of times that people are either under or overstaffed, and it's leading to additional issues, whether that be the output of the veterinarians or the cash flow. We definitely recommend taking a look at that staffing as something that can be rectified pretty quickly. Another thing is inventory. If there's a ton of inventory sitting on the shelf, that's eating up your cash on hand. And also, if there's not enough inventory, it's going to slow sales. So that's another piece that we definitely say to look at. Another area of opportunity for a vet practice is actually adding some new offerings, whether that be, updating some equipment or adding, additional acupuncture or something like that. Those are really generating a lot of cash flow for a lot of practices out there. So if you're looking to add some additional revenue quickly to increase that value, those are, one, areas to look at, and two,
yeah, they're easy to do. So again, Schwanda, anything you want to add to that list? I mean, this isn't rocket science, guys. If you're trying to sell your clinic, you want to expand the amount of revenue and hopefully your profitability in the meanwhile. I mean, so anything else you'd add to that list that say, hey, this is how you could boost or pump up that bottom line?
Yeah, I think one of the other things that I would say is to look at all those personal expenses, because sometimes you might not realize things like automobile expenses, insurance expenses, cell phones, some of those things that are personal expenses. You might not, like you said, you had your friend sort of got dinged. You might not get credit for all of those back at the end of the day when you're ready to sell. So be sure that those are not way out of line with the benchmarks. And, I think that I'm very data driven. I encourage veterinarians to take a look at the benchmarks. There's great resources so that you can find benchmarking for cost of goods sold. What does your cost of goods sold look like? What is your DVM production? I mean, if you've got DVMs who either aren't producing or are underproducing or overproducing, that's important to know, especially in a transition. It's also important for an owner to recognize, I've kind of stepped back. And if there was another DVM here, they could be producing, twice as much as I am because I'm not seeing as many patients. And so those are really important things when you start to look at the bottom line that can impact what you're going to get at the end of the day for your practice.
Yeah, and it's guys, let me tell you what actually is happening behind the curtain is they're looking at your practice, they're going, wow, they're underperforming. And that means we can pay less. I mean, this isn't rocket science, as I'll say again, Schwanda. It's something that I'm looking for, an investment opportunity, which is what you're looking for when you are buying something. And of course, to increase the value, you've got to do all of these things and more. Schwanda, one of the things, historically, I think the model has been to retain real estate whenever possible during a transition. I'm hearing different things these days. There have been some changes, certainly in some tax laws and shielding abilities. But what is your general take on sell the clinic with the real estate or without?
I really feel like it's a personal decision for that owner. I think that there are some owners who are ready to not practice, and they want to kind of step back from actually seeing patients and being involved in that day to day grind in the clinic. But they're not really ready to retire. They still need some revenue sources. I mean, so a lot of those practices are retaining the real estate. Honestly, most corporate purchases, they're not purchasing the real estate. They really, most of the time in a majority of those transactions, they're purchasing the practice and not the real estate. And so, but along with that comes a lot of headaches too. And so we encourage buyers to try to negotiate the best deal for the practice and the real estate. That provides collateral for the borrower. And it really helps the bank from a lending perspective, because there's just built-in collateral with that real estate. Now, there are some cases where a younger veterinarian, an associate veterinarian, maybe they don't have the cash that they need to buy the practice and the real estate. So there are lots of situations where the seller will hold on to the real estate for a couple of years, knowing that in just a few years, that buyer is going to want to buy the real estate then. And so they spread those transactions out. And sometimes that helps for tax, kind of some of the tax incentives that are out there. I do not think it's as beneficial as it was in the past to hold on to everything. It's okay now to kind of let go of the practice and the real estate.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ashlee, again, this is where you really have to have an excellent tax attorney or at least some financial advisor like you. I mean, I know you guys help out in some of these situations, but it's a lot more complicated than just, okay, can I sell it all to you? Because the tax implications can be significant.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we always tell people, have a team of experts. We don't expect the veterinarians that we work with to know the ins and outs of tax law or what goes into a loan. And that's why you need an accountant, a lawyer, a banker, somebody who understands this industry and what they are looking at, and just can provide that education and guidance.
Oh, guys, and again, as someone who has built, sold, and bought over the years, even the timing, can play huge impact on your taxes. So again, just do your due diligence if you're considering a sale. You're gonna have to plan far in advance, because if you just say, oh, I think I'll sell next month, it's just not gonna happen. And if it does, you're really gonna be penalized, I think. So that leads us kind of the last thing I want to talk to you guys today, and that is the pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages potentially of selling to a corporate buyer versus a private buyer. I mean, what do you guys, so Ashlee, just sort of to start off with, what do you see the difference? Obviously, valuation is going to be different. So I think the corporate buyers typically are paying significantly more in general, but there are some disadvantages. So maybe talk us through the corporate side of things.
I think with corporations, one thing that's difficult for a lot of owners is that they're giving up that control. They've had their patients for X amount of years and have a standard of care that they've built their reputation on, and that really matters to them more than that additional money. So I think that that's the biggest disadvantage of selling to a corporation is they're taking over complete control of your practice. There's, you don't really have that say afterward. Obviously there's, money involved there that it's incentive to sell that way. I think that a lot of people are dissuaded because of that.
Yeah. So Schwanda, what about, the private buyer? I mean, again, it's a different transaction. You may take less money up front, but as Ashlee said, you may retain certain control aspects. I mean, so why would I sell to a private entity?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that a lot of the corporate entities are going to also want the owner and the veterinarians there to stay for 3-5 years, something like that. With a transition with a private buyer, there is going to be a transition period, but it's more likely that that's 3 to 6 months, something like that. And so that's a much easier transition for a veterinarian who is ready to get out and retire and sell their practice and go and enjoy some free time. So that's a huge difference, is the time period for the transition. I think the other difference is when you're selling to an individual buyer, you have that control to be sure that the person that you sell to is going to embrace the culture and the business that you've built, for the last, 20 years or whatever it is, and that they're going to take care of your staff and your patients in the same way that you did. So that is, that's something that's really important to a lot of sellers. This is a family. Even though veterinarians are taking care of animals, it's very much a people business. These are our family members, that you're taking care of. And that transition is important. And so many sellers don't want to sell to a corporate entity because they want it to be run the same way that they've run it for the last 20 years. They want to know that the new owner is going to be a part of the community like they were. They're going to take care of the patients like they did. And they're also going to take care of the staff. That's very important to a lot of sellers, to be sure that there's a transition plan in place for the staff. And that the new owner doesn't come in and let everybody go or bring in all new staff, or that's something that's very important to a lot of sellers.
Yeah, and again, it's just what price is control for you. I mean, honestly, that's when people are talking to me about this and they're asking me for my advice, I'm like, look, it's really a control issue, and what's the price of that? So some people, it's a pretty high bar, and some people it's a little lower. Right. One thing too, we focused a lot, Ashlee, with the seller aspect, but you also need to be involved with the buyer, and you guys of course represent all sides of these transactions. So if you're watching today and you're saying, well, I'd like to buy a clinic in the next 2, 3, 4 years, I think they also need to start learning what the process looks like. So what advice would you give to a younger associate perhaps who is saying, I'd like to buy a clinic over the next 2, 3, 4 years? What should they be doing today?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, reach out to us. It's never too early. Even like you said, if it's 3, 4, 5, however many years down the road, Schwanda and myself, we are always happy to talk with you, always happy to, walk you through the entire process, let you know what you need as a buyer to have ready when, to start the process. When you do start looking at clinics, one, don't accept outdated financials. Make sure that you have a full picture of that practice that you're getting into. Another piece of advice that we give a lot of associates is, this is a business transaction. Do not get emotional. A lot of times there'll be an associate at a clinic and their plan is to take it over, and that doesn't always work out. Sometimes a corporation will come in, sometimes just something falls through. Remember that this is business. Don't let emotions get involved. There will be the perfect practice for you. But, again, above all, it's never too early to start that conversation. Reach out to Schwanda or myself, and we'll start walking you through the process and get you ready.
Right, and you shouldn't be embarrassed. I mean, we aren't taught a lot of these business protocols and concepts, so it's really good to start to educate yourself. And again, another true story, guys. Just so what how serious this can be, Ashlee. Young associate, been working at the clinic for about 6 years. Suddenly the owner says, hey, I'm interested in selling, and I'm going to sell to you or to a corporate. And so basically this person knew that they were busy, but the vet presented them with some data and said, this is what we're grossing, and I won't take a penny less than that. And the person said, okay, because, I want to own this practice or be a co-owner of this practice. And 6 months later, the owner had gone, and lo and behold, the numbers weren't holding up, and for a variety of reasons, right? I'm not saying there was malicious intent, but now she had paid way more than the practice was worth. Yeah. And, it really broke my heart to hear her tell me this story, because number one, there's nothing I can do to fix it. And number two, it's just like, well, buyer beware, right? I mean, that's just kind of part of the deal when we're talking about some of these things, for sure. All right. Well, guys, any last bits of advice, you want to give to the person out there who's thinking about selling their clinic? Because again, I think it's a seller's market. Schwanda, we'll start with you. Just any little last minute nuggets and why they should contact First Financial Bank.
Yeah, I think that sometimes, like you said, just veterinary, they don't know where to start. They're just not sure what the process looks like. They're not sure where to start. this is very emotional. And so, like anything in our lives, this has been their life and they have built this up and, put blood, sweat, and tears into it. And so it's always worth more to us than it might be to others. So it's great to get some advice from professionals, from a lender. What do you think that this is worth? What do I need to do to be prepared? Start having those conversations so that when you do find the right opportunity, you're ready to jump on it. I think sometimes that's the biggest mistake we make, is that we have the perfect person walk in who might want to take over and buy our clinic, and we're not ready. We haven't prepared. So my biggest piece of advice is just be prepared so that when an opportunity presents itself, you're ready.
Schwanda, it's kind of funny. For 25 years, I've used a line that my father taught me in almost all of my lectures. And it goes like, and people misinterpret it all the time, but I think you'll understand exactly the intent. And that my father taught me to run your business like you're trying to sell your business. And so, so many people unfortunately took that to say, oh, you're always looking for the exit signs. It was like, no, this is good business practice, So Ashlee, any little last bits of advice or just, try to help them, encouragement?
Yeah, I think one thing that I would say for sure, just, to kind of take what Schwanda said, a little bit further, you want to have a team that you can trust, that can help guide you if you don't know where to go. If you're ready to sell and you have no idea, you want people that are in your corner that you have full faith in. For example, like our team, we're not really bankers. We come from the industry. We've been small business owners. We were started by a DVM, our division. So we understand what, it takes to, one, run a veterinary practice, and two, what that means is to be a business owner. So, build a team around you that you can trust, that'll, really point you in the right direction.
Yeah, that is great advice. And, one of the things that so impressed me with Schwanda when I first met her, she's a small business person. She's a medical professional. She's a pharmacist by training, if I remember correctly. And so you've been on all sides of this equation. So I really appreciate your expertise and enthusiasm for helping our profession. Guys, you can see clearly why Vertical Vet wants to partner with people like First Financial Bank, because they not only lend a level of expertise to a transaction that can be life-changing for most of us, but they're here to give us advice, even if they don't handle the transaction. So I can't thank you guys enough for spending some time with our family today and giving them some guidance. How can they reach out and if they want to contact First Financial Bank, what's the best way to get started?
Yeah, so they can go to our website, www.ff1.com. We have a ton of resources when it comes to, selling or buying veterinary practices. They can fill out forms on there to be able to reach us. You can email Schwanda or myself, or follow us on social media at ffbank1.com.
Yeah. And again, Vertical Vet, we've got all their contact information. So if you want to go through us, we'll point you in the right direction, hook you up immediately. These guys are amazing. And again, I will say this, even if you just are in the exploratory phase of this, reach out to them. They love to help vets. I can tell you this team's love of the profession, respect for the profession, and enthusiasm is just unmatched. So that's why, again, Vertical Vet is so proud to be partnering with people like First Financial Bank. So again, thank you guys so much for spending time with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, guys, that's it for another exciting episode here of Vertical Vet Business Academy. You can see, again, clearly we try to bring experts to you that can help you thrive and practice. And of course, if you're looking to sell your practice, it's never too early to begin preparing. In fact, you may be needing to prepare years in advance. So definitely let's reach out to First Financial Bank. If you want to find out more, you can go through us at Vertical Vet. You can contact us or your rep, or you can go directly to ffb1.com. We'll include all of the links below. Guys, thanks again on behalf of the entire Vertical Vet team. I am Dr. Ernie Ward. It's been my pleasure to spend this time with you. Bye.